Chapter 1: A Short History. Back in England's oldest times, people lived in big groups called tribes. They were farmers, they grew their food and kept animals for meat and eggs. They lived in villages in wooden or mud houses, and there was often fighting between the different tribes. Life was simple but dangerous. Then in AD 43, 40,000 Roman soldiers invaded England from the area of Europe that is now Italy. The Roman army was very well organized and had good weapons. The soldiers built a wall around themselves every night so they were safe. They moved across the country fighting and winning battles against the different tribes, and after 4 years they controlled the south of England. The Romans had to fight for many years before they controlled all of England. They made many changes in the country, such as building towns and cities and good roads. They brought a new language to England, Latin, and made laws so people knew what they could and could not do. The religion of Christianity came to England in Roman times too. The Romans never took control of Scotland, which is north of England, and Scottish tribes came to fight against them in the north of England again and again. Because of this, in the 2nd century AD, the Romans built a wall to stop the Scottish tribes coming to England. This wall between England and Scotland was 120 kilometers long and was called Hadrian's Wall. For English people in towns and cities, life in Roman times was good. Towns now had clean water and sewers, pipes taking away dirty water, and there were strong walls around them so people felt safe. People came to the towns to buy and sell things, and food became more interesting and enjoyable. To relax, people could go to special bath houses where they met their friends, kept clean, and exercised. But after AD 250, Roman soldiers began to leave England. They had to fight in other parts of the world, and it was too expensive and difficult for them to keep England safe. By AD 411, all the Roman soldiers had left England. Then the Anglo-Saxons from Germany, the Netherlands, and Denmark began to arrive. The Anglo-Saxons had come to England several times before, but the Romans had always defeated them. Now, with the Romans gone, the English could not win battles against the Anglo-Saxons, and many Anglo-Saxons came to live in England. The Anglo-Saxons did not like the Romans' towns, so they did not use them, and the towns stayed empty. The Anglo-Saxons built their own villages near rivers or the sea and made wooden houses. In their villages they grew crops, plants they could use for food. They also kept pigs, sheep, and cows, and caught fish and other animals. By AD 600 in England, the Anglo-Saxons had made 7 kingdoms. Different parts of the country, each controlled by its own king. The 4 main kingdoms were Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex. The 3 minor kingdoms were Essex, Kent, and Sussex. In each of these kingdoms the king had nobles, important men who fought for him. The other people in the kingdom were either peasants or slaves. Peasants were poor people who had some land but had to give money to the nobles. Slaves had nothing and had to work for other people for no money at all. People bought and sold slaves like animals. The Anglo-Saxons stayed in England, but in AD 793 a new group of people invaded the country. The Vikings from Norway, Sweden, and Denmark wanted good farming land. They came to England in strong wooden ships, and soon they took control of many parts of the country. But the Anglo-Saxon king of Wessex, Alfred the Great, won a big battle against the Vikings. After this, part of England called Danelaw was given to the Vikings, but the Vikings had to promise not to invade other parts of the country. After Alfred the Great died, the Viking and Anglo-Saxon parts of England came together, and England was now ruled as one country, with one king. The Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons continued to fight a lot, and for a while England had Viking kings. But by 1042 the Anglo-Saxon king Edward ruled England. With Edward as the king, London became the most important city in England. Edward had many nobles, and he let them become very powerful. He had no children, so when he died, one of his nobles, Harold, became the king. But Edward's cousin William, a Norman from the north of France, believed that he should be the king of England. In October 1066, William brought a big Norman army from France to England. The Normans fought against Harold and his soldiers at the Battle of Hastings. Harold was killed, and William the Conqueror, as he was called, became the King of England. William the Conqueror made many important changes in England. A lot of castles were built. One of these was the Tower of London, which you can visit today. William the Conqueror brought the feudal system to England. In the feudal system, the richest and most important person was the king. Below the king were the nobles, then the knights, and then the serfs, who were the poorest people in the land. The king owned everything in the country, but he gave a castle and land to his nobles, and they paid him money. The nobles gave land to the knights, who had to fight battles for the nobles and the king. The knights gave some land to the serfs, who had to work for the knights and give them food from the land. William the Conqueror wanted to know exactly what he had in England. He sent people all around the country asking many questions, and they made a big book called the Domesday Book. The book showed how much farming land there was in England and how many animals. We know a lot about life in Norman England because of the Domesday Book. The time from William the Conqueror's rule until the 15th century in England is often called the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, most people lived in villages. The people of the village had to work for the nobles and give them crops and animals. The nobles lived very well in big houses and with expensive food, but most people were very poor. Religion was very important in the Middle Ages, and the Catholic Church became very powerful. From 1095 to 1291, soldiers went to other countries to fight religious battles. There was more fighting in the 14th and 15th centuries as France and England fought the 100 Years' War, hoping to win land from each other. Many of the battles of the 100 Years' War were fought by knights. As well as fighting battles for nobles and for the king, knights also fought as a sport in competitions called jousting tournaments. Young men who wanted to become knights had to spend many years learning all the things that a knight could do. In 1348, a terrible illness called the Black Death came to England. Only about 4 million people lived in England at that time, but in 2 years nearly 1.5 million of them died. From 1455 to 1485 there were terrible battles between people who wanted the kings of the country to be from different families, and many more people died. Finally, in 1485 Henry Tudor became the first Tudor king of England, King Henry VII. Some of the Tudor kings and queens are now very famous in England's history. Henry VIII, who became the king in 1509, lived some of the time at the Tower of London, but he had other beautiful palaces in and around London, including the Palace of Westminster and Hampton Court. He and the people around him lived very well. They wore the best clothes and ate wonderful food, and at the palaces there was always dancing, sport, poetry, and music. Henry enjoyed life, and he drank and ate too much. When he became the king, he was a sporty, good-looking young man, but later he became so fat he could not walk. England was a Catholic country, but Henry VIII wanted England to leave the Catholic Church, so he started a new church. It was a Protestant church, a Christian church, but for people who believe in a different kind of Christianity, called the Church of England, and he controlled it. Anyone who disagreed with the new church was executed, killed for their crime. When Henry VIII was ruling England, more than 70,000 people were killed because of crimes or because they disagreed with the king about religion or other important things. 6 years after Henry VIII died, his oldest daughter Mary, the daughter he had with his first wife Catherine of Aragon, became Queen Mary I of England. She was a Catholic and wanted England to be a Catholic country again, but many people had left the Catholic Church and had become Protestants. Mary executed hundreds of Protestants who refused to become Catholic again. But in 1558 Mary died, and her half-sister Elizabeth, the daughter Henry had with his second wife and Boleyn, became the queen. Queen Elizabeth I was a Protestant, but she did not make Catholics follow her religion, and she soon became one of the best loved of England's kings and queens. The second half of the 16th century, which was known as the Elizabethan period, was a very important time for English literature. Many people liked to go to the theatre, and William Shakespeare wrote a lot of plays and poetry at this time. Ships also began to travel to other parts of the world. Sir Walter Raleigh sailed to America, and Sir Francis Drake became the first Englishman to sail around the world. But life in England was also very difficult for many people in the Elizabethan period. There was less work in farming now, and a lot of people were very poor. There was a lot of crime but no police, and when people were caught for crimes they were often executed. Alter Queen Elizabeth I died in 1603. Kings and queens called the Stuarts came to power in England. The Stuarts were from Scotland, and for the first time they ruled both England and Scotland. The second of the Stuart kings was Charles I. He argued with Parliament because he spent a lot of money fighting wars in Europe, and in 1642 he started a civil war. For 7 years the king's men and Parliament's men fought against each other, and thousands died. But with Oliver Cromwell as leader, Parliament's army became very strong and fought very well, and in 1649 they won the war. Charles I was executed, and for 11 years England had no king or queen. The country was ruled by Cromwell and Parliament. Cromwell was a Puritan, a Protestant who believed in a simple, hard-working life. And when he ruled, there was no sport or dancing in England, and theatres were closed. When Cromwell died, England was ready to have a king again, and the Stuarts came to power once more. There were some difficult times for England in the second half of the 17th century. In 1665, another terrible illness came to London and killed nearly 70,000 people, and a year later large parts of London were burnt down in the Great Fire of London. There were many other changes at this time too. England now traded, bought and sold things with many other countries, so English people could get different foods like tomatoes, chocolate, coffee, and tea for the first time. People continued to work on the land, but now there were other jobs in cloth making or glass making and in the coal or iron industries. London was rebuilt with wider roads and many beautiful new buildings, and scientists like Sir Isaac Newton began to do important work and learn many interesting things. England started its first colonies too. These were other parts of the world like America, which were ruled by England. For the first time in the 17th century, people from England went to live and work in these places. There was one more important change as England entered the 18th century. In 1707, the Act of Union brought England, Wales, and Scotland together with one parliament as Great Britain. The 18th and early 19th centuries were called the Georgian period because Britain's kings were George I, II, III, and IV. But during this time, kings became much less powerful and Parliament really began to rule the country. An industrial revolution began in Britain too. Machines were built and they were used in many different industries. People could now make many things very quickly, and because of this, towns began to grow. In 1783, Britain lost the American War of Independence, so America was no longer ruled by Britain and became independent. Britain did not have its old American colonies anymore, but it now found new ones. In that same year, France gave its colonies in Canada to Britain, and by the end of the 18th century, Britain had won many battles in India, which soon became an important part of the British Empire. This was a great time for exploration, traveling to different places to find new things. The famous sailor Captain Cook visited many new lands and was the first European to go to Australia and New Zealand. In 1801, Ireland and Britain came together as the United Kingdom, UK, with one parliament. Today, Northern Ireland is the only part of Ireland which belongs to the UK. The ruler of this new UK from 1837 until 1901 was Queen Victoria. Victoria ruled for longer than any other English or British king or queen, and she was much loved by many of her people. In the Victorian period, the British Empire became bigger and more important, and the Industrial Revolution continued. The country was growing, but at first this made life difficult for many people. More and more factories were built in the UK, and factory work was very hard and very dangerous. Towns got bigger and bigger, but people put their rubbish and dirty water in the streets, so there was a lot of illness. But soon important new changes started to happen. Towns became cleaner, and in 1880 all children aged 5 to 10 began to go to school. People had electric lights and telephones for the first time, and because the railways grew they could now travel around the country easily. By 1901, when Queen Victoria died, the modern United Kingdom was arriving. Chapter 2: England in the modern UK. In the early 1900s, the UK was one of the most powerful countries in the world with a big empire. The Industrial Revolution was changing many people's lives, and steamships and cars were widely used for the first time. Rich people lived very well with beautiful houses and servants, but poor people had few clothes and little to eat, and their children were often ill. Life was difficult for women in the UK at this time too. People expected women to stay at home with their families, and they could not get well-paid jobs. It was very difficult for women to go to university, and they could not vote. In 1903, a group of women called the Suffragettes, led by Emmeline Pankhurst, organized meetings and marches asking for Parliament to give women the vote. In 1914, the UK and its allies France and Russia went to war with Germany and Austria-Hungary. Many young men chose to fight. They believed the war would be very short, but it went on for 4 years, and nearly 750,000 soldiers from the UK were killed. While the men were fighting, women had to do the men's jobs at home. Women soon showed that they could work in farming factories and even in the coal industry. After helping their country to win the First World War, workers and women in England wanted better lives. Men got their jobs at home back from the women, so most women were no longer working. But in 1918, women over 30 were given the vote for the first time. From 1929, women, like men, could vote from the age of 21. A new political party for working people, the Labour Party, became important in politics at this time. And in 1926, 500,000 workers went on strike to fight against low pay and long working hours. But life became even more difficult for workers in 1929, when the world went into an economic depression. Prices fell, there was less trade, and many shops and factories closed. By 1931, nearly 3 million people in the UK had lost their jobs. The First World War was fought mainly in battles on fields in France, but almost everyone in the UK had a difficult life because of the Second World War, 1939 to 45. Many children had to leave their homes and go to live in the countryside. This was because at the end of 1940 and the beginning of 1941, the Germans dropped many bombs on London and other cities. This was called the Blitz. Many people lost their homes and their families, and everyone had to live on rations. They could only buy fixed amounts of many kinds of food. When we heard the air raid warning in the middle of the night, everyone woke up and got into the shelters. The Second World War ended in 1945, and big changes were made by a new Labour government. Most importantly, the UK now had a national health service, so anyone who was ill could see a doctor or go to hospital without paying. The government also now gave money to help people who were ill or old or had lost their jobs. Because of the Education Act of 1944, there were also free places in schools for children up to the age of 15. Another change after the Second World War was that more women went to work. They had shown that they could do men's jobs, and many of them had done important war work. In some homes nothing was different for women. But over the next 50 years, women in the UK slowly saw changes for themselves in education, work, and at home. Their lives would never be the same again. After the Second World War, many of the UK's colonies wanted to rule themselves. The south of Ireland had already become independent from the UK in 1921, so the country had now become the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. People from the colonies had fought for the UK during the war, and they felt they had won their freedom. In 1947, India, once a very important part of the empire, became independent. In the next 20 years, most of the other colonies also did the same. They became independent but joined the Commonwealth, an organization of the governments of the UK's old colonies. The UK needed more workers to help rebuild the country after the war, so the government invited other Europeans and people from the colonies of the old empire to move there. Hoping to find good new jobs, many people came mainly from Europe, India, Pakistan, and the West Indies. In 1945, there were only a few thousand non-white people in the UK, but by 1970 there were 1.4 million. Sadly, there were often problems in later years when some of the people born in the UK felt that immigrants and their families were taking too many jobs. There is some racism when people do not like others because they have a different color skin in the UK today. But most people do not like racism and want all people in the UK to live together happily. In 1952, Elizabeth II became the new Queen of the UK, and millions of people watched her coronation on TV. The first TVs were made in the 1920s, but many English people bought TVs for the first time for the coronation. And in the 1950s, TV started to become an important part of life in England. There were many changes in the UK in the second half of the 20th century. Many of the country's traditional industries, for example iron, cloth, coal, and shipbuilding, began to have problems. And people working in those industries lost their jobs. New industries became more important, for example banking and pharmaceuticals, drugs and medicines. England today is a very different place than it was 100 years ago. Today, England is one of the most multicultural countries in the world, and many people from the West Indies, Africa, India, China, Southeast Asia, and Eastern Europe live here. More than 250 different languages are spoken in London. Probably because of this, there are also many religions in England. England is a Christian country, but different religions are freely followed, and there are many Hindu, Jewish, Muslim, Sikh, and Buddhist people here. Society has changed in England too. 100 years ago, most people married in their early 20s or younger and then had children, but today many more people live alone, and most do not get married or have children until they are in their 30s or older. England's place in the world as part of the UK is also very different. The UK does not have an empire now, but it is an important country in Europe and became a member of the European Union, then called the EEC, in 1973. The UK works very closely with the United States of America, USA, and it also continues to be a member of the Commonwealth together with 52 other countries from around the world. Members of the Commonwealth meet every 2 years to decide how they can best work together. Chapter 3: Traditions. Because England is such an old country, it has many traditions. Some of these have come from important or interesting moments in history. Some have come from other parts of the world. Others have come from England's many kings or queens or from its long religious history. There are special days and festivals throughout the year in England, but only a few are bank holidays, days when people do not have to work. Christmas is one of the most important religious festivals in England. Christmas Day, December 25th, and the next day, Boxing Day, are always bank holidays, and most people spend this time with family or friends. Traditionally, people eat turkey on Christmas Day with Brussels sprouts and cranberry sauce. And for dessert there is usually Christmas pudding, a type of cake made with dried fruit. Not long before Christmas, people decorate 42 their houses and send cards to people they know. On Christmas Day there are presents from friends and family, and for the children from Father Christmas or Santa Claus. Children believe that Father Christmas brings the presents on December 24th, Christmas Eve, and leaves them to be opened on the morning of Christmas Day. New Year's Eve is also important in England. Many people go to the Houses of Parliament in London to hear Big Ben, the bell inside the big clock tower, strike midnight, and to see the wonderful fireworks near the River Thames. Other people meet up with friends and family and make New Year's resolutions. They decide what things they will do or not do in the next year. On Valentine's Day, February 14th, people give cards or presents to the people they love, but April Fool's Day on April 1st is a very different kind of celebration. On that day, people play jokes on their friends and family and call them an April Fool. People think April Fool's Day started because before 1562 April 1st was the first day of the year. In 1562 this was changed so January 1st became the first day of the year. But many people were slow to remember the change, so they were laughed at for celebrating New Year's Day on April 1st. There is often special food for festivals in England. Shrove Tuesday in February comes the day before the start of Lent, the 40 days before Easter. In the past, people stopped eating the most important foods, butter, eggs, and flour, during Lent. So on Shrove Tuesday they made pancakes with these foods and ate butter, eggs, and flour for the last time. People continue to eat pancakes today, and there are many pancake races around the country. People have to run throwing pancakes up and down in a frying pan. Today, many people try to give something up for Lent too, often sweets, cakes, or chocolate. After Lent comes Easter, another religious festival, and for people who go to church, a very important time of year. Easter comes in the spring, and many people give each other Easter eggs and Easter bunnies, little rabbits, made from chocolate. For children there are often Easter egg hunts when little eggs are hidden in the house or garden. People also eat hot cross buns at Easter, warm sweet bread with dried fruit inside and a cross on top. May Day in England is on the first day of May, and there is a bank holiday on or very near that day. This is usually the start of warmer weather in England, and sometimes people celebrate with maypole dancing around a big pole with ribbons. Halloween on October 31st has become a popular festival in modern times. On this night, children dress up as witches, ghosts, and other frightening things and go from house to house calling trick or treat. The neighbors give them sweets and other nice things, but if they have nothing to give the children, play a trick or joke on them. A strange festival is held on November 5th. On that day in 1605, a man called Guy Fawkes and a group of friends tried to blow up the Houses of Parliament. They wanted to do this because King James and his nobles were not treating the Catholics in the country well. But the king's soldiers found Guy Fawkes in the Houses of Parliament and stopped him and his friends. Now on November 5th every year there are bonfires and fireworks all over England on Guy Fawkes Night. Another day that is important because of something in history is Remembrance Day on November 11th. At 11 o'clock in the morning on that day, at exactly the time when the First World War ended in 1918, many people are silent for 2 minutes. They remember the many men and women who have lost their lives in wars. Many people wear paper poppies, red flowers, on their coats at this time too. Poppies grew on the battlefields of France after the First World War ended, so they make people remember the terrible days of the war. Because kings and queens have always been so important in England's history, there are many royal traditions. One important tradition is the state opening of Parliament. On this day the Queen goes from her home at Buckingham Palace to the Houses of Parliament in a gold carriage and then reads the Queen's speech. This tells people what the government wants to do in the next year. Another important yearly royal tradition is called Trooping the Colour. To celebrate the Queen's birthday, more than 1,000 soldiers and musicians march from Buckingham Palace to Whitehall and back again, and the Queen goes past them in her carriage. On most days at Buckingham Palace you can also see the changing of the guard. This is when one group of soldiers who were guarding the Queen leave the palace and another group arrives. The soldiers who guard the Queen wear red coats and tall hats made from real bearskin. They can march in front of the palace, but when they are standing they must not move. There are many important traditions in sport in England. One famous example is the Oxford and Cambridge boat race. Oxford and Cambridge are the two oldest universities in England, and because both universities are in cities with rivers, Oxford and Cambridge students have always enjoyed rowing. In rowing, 2, 4, or 8 people move a boat through water with long wooden sticks called oars. They sit with their backs towards the front of the boat, so there is often a person called a cox at the back telling them where to go. In 1829, students from Oxford and Cambridge decided to have a rowing race, and since then there has been a race on the Thames every year in spring. The Oxford and Cambridge boat race, Oxford in dark blue, Cambridge in light blue. What is traditional English food and drink? Fish and chips are probably England's most famous dish. Fish and chips first became popular in the 1860s when the railways opened and trains began to bring fish from the east coast of England to the cities. Fish and chips are usually eaten as takeaway food, food that is not eaten in a cafe or restaurant, with the fish wrapped in paper and the chips covered in salt and vinegar. Today, Indian and Chinese takeaways are just as popular as fish and chips. England is also famous for its breakfasts. Very few people eat a full English breakfast every day, but you can usually get one in hotels or cafes. The English breakfast is toast, eggs and sausages, often with tomatoes, beans, hash browns, potato cakes, and mushrooms too. Bangers, sausages, and mash, a mixture of potatoes with butter and milk, is another traditional dish in England. The sausages are often called bangers because in times of war, when food was rationed, there was usually a lot of water in the sausages. When they were fried, they often blew up. The traditional Sunday lunch is a roast dinner with roast beef, roast potatoes, and Yorkshire pudding, a cooked mixture of eggs, flour, and milk. However, many English people now eat fewer traditional dishes, and English people now eat lots of different kinds of food from all around the world. But some traditional English food continues to be very popular. English farmers make wonderful cheeses like red Leicester cheddar and Stilton, and at farmers' markets all around the country people can buy fantastic meat, fish, fruit, vegetables, and bread. Tea, of course, is one of the most important drinks in England and in cafes, and at home many people like to have afternoon tea, which is tea with cakes and sandwiches. English people also like to go to the pub to have a drink and perhaps to eat. These are places where people come together to talk, play games, or watch football or rugby matches. In different areas of England there are some very strange traditions. At many fairs you can see Morris dancing, people in costumes dancing to music with sticks, swords, and handkerchiefs. In the Lake District people have a gurning competition every year. Gurning is trying to make a very strange face, for example, by lifting the bottom of your mouth up above the top of it. And in a village near Gloucester there is a cheese rolling competition in which people run after a cheese which is moving like a wheel down a very big hill. Chapter 4: Cities and Sights. England has 50 cities and many smaller towns, and there are lots of things to see and do there. The biggest city and England's capital is London. Nearly 8 million people live in London, more than in any other European city. The country's government is there, and for people in many different jobs, London is the most important place to be for work. For visitors too, London has many of England's most interesting sights and is one of the most important places to visit. London has many areas which are often very different even if they are very close. Whitehall and Westminster are the areas where you can see some of London's most famous sights. Here next to the River Thames are Big Ben and the Houses of Parliament. At one time England's kings and queens lived in these buildings, and they were called the Palace of Westminster, but today Parliament meets here, Near the Houses of Parliament is Downing Street, where the UK's Prime Minister, the leader, lives and where the government meets. Also near here is Westminster Abbey, a large and very important church where England's kings and queens have had their coronations since the time of William the Conqueror. Following the Thames to the north and then towards the east from Whitehall and Westminster you come to the West End. Here you can find theatres, restaurants, cinemas and clubs. Covent Garden, where there was once a big market, is now a great place to go shopping or to have a coffee and watch the street entertainers. Actors, musicians, dancers, and others who do small shows outside. Further east is a small area called the City of London, which was the most important part of London in the Middle Ages. It is now one of the great financial centers of the world, a place where money comes in and out and where England's big banks work from. Also here is St. Paul's Cathedral, which was built by the great architect Sir Christopher Wren, and the Tower of London, a castle, from the 11th century. London is also famous for its large and beautiful parks. Just minutes from the West End, people can walk, exercise, and relax in the large green areas of Hyde Park, Green Park, and St. James's Park. Many people visit London for its museums and art galleries, and most of these are free. The Tate Modern is the world's largest modern art gallery, and at the British Museum there are several kilometers of rooms, with more than 70,000 things to see. Many visitors to London like to take a ride on the London Eye, the largest Ferris wheel in Europe. From the top of the Eye at 135 meters you can see many of London's most famous buildings. Not far from London you can visit three interesting and important royal places. Windsor Castle, which continues to be used by the royal family today, Hampton Court Palace, and Kew Gardens. It is less than 100 kilometers from London to Oxford, one of England's most beautiful cities and home to its oldest university. Here you can walk around the fantastic old buildings of colleges like Christ Church and Magdalen, many of them more than 500 years old. Oxford also has England's oldest museum, the Ashmolean, as well as parks, gardens, and lovely river walks. Oxford is near a famous area of England called the Cotswolds. Close to the green hills there are beautiful villages with pretty houses made from gold-colored stone and fine old churches. Many visitors come to this area, and there are tourist shops and afternoon tea rooms in a lot of bigger villages. Oxford is not very far from Stratford-upon-Avon, famous as the hometown of William Shakespeare, the great writer. In this pretty river town you can visit Shakespeare's old house and also see a play at the theatre of the Royal Shakespeare Company. At Warwick, just a few kilometers away, is one of the greatest medieval castles in England. With its great towers and walls, dark dungeons, and beautiful gardens, Warwick Castle is one of the most impressive in England. The University of Cambridge is almost as old as Oxford's, and the two cities are like each other in many ways. Like Oxford, Cambridge is a city of old colleges, many from the late 13th and early 14th centuries. With its gardens, green spaces, and river, Cambridge is a lovely city to walk around. Two of the most famous places in Cambridge are King's College with its beautiful chapel, a small church, and The back's an area of green land around the River Cam from where you can see many of the colleges. Moving north, England's second biggest city is Birmingham, which was an important centre during the Industrial Revolution. Today, Birmingham is a very multicultural city and is home to the National Exhibition Centre, NEC, where many big shows and events are held. Many people come to Birmingham to visit its big modern shopping centre, the Bull Ring, but few tourists spend a lot of time here. Further north of Birmingham, Stoke-on-Trent has been famous since the 17th century for its pottery industry, the industry of making objects such as cups, plates, and bowls. Here you can visit the pottery factories and buy pottery cheaply from the factory shops. York is one of the most interesting cities of the north of England. It was a Roman city, and for many years it was an important place for religion and politics in England. During medieval times, the Middle Ages, there was a strong wool trade in York, and because of this many other traders came to live here. The city feels very medieval even today with its narrow streets and old walls. Many tourists come to visit the city and to see York Minster, the city's old cathedral, a large and important church, with its beautiful windows. York was an important city when the railways were first built in England, and now it is home to the National Railway Museum. 25 kilometers from York is Castle Howard, one of the best of England's stately homes, big country houses. Stately homes were built for the most important families of England, who normally had homes in London too. These homes were places where the king or queen could visit and where important people could have meetings about politics or government. Two very exciting cities in the north of England are Liverpool and Manchester. Liverpool, which is on the sea, became important in the 18th century because of trade with America. Many immigrants from the West Indies, China, and Ireland arrived in Liverpool when they came to England, so Liverpool was one of England's first multicultural cities. But by the 1970s and 1980s, ships were no longer coming to Liverpool. The city's old buildings stayed empty and it became very poor. Since 2004, a lot of money has been spent in Liverpool, and Albert Dock, where ships used to arrive, is now an exciting new area, with restaurants, museums, shops, and art galleries. Liverpool was home to the Beatles, and many people come here to do Beatles tours and to visit the clubs where the famous band played or see the homes where John, Paul, George, and Ringo lived. In Liverpool you can also see some wonderful art at the Walker Art Gallery or Tate. Liverpool, visit the two cathedrals, or take a boat across the River Mersey and look back at the famous sights of this great city. Just 50 kilometers east of Liverpool is another big city, Manchester. Manchester has some of the most exciting modern buildings in England. Its cafes, clubs, and nightlife make it one of the best cities in the country for many young people. But like Liverpool, Manchester had a difficult time in the second half of the 20th century. Once the most important city in the world for cotton, Manchester's old industries were coming to an end by the 1950s, and many people lost their jobs. But new industries began to grow, and at the start of the 21st century parts of the city were rebuilt, making Manchester an exciting city once more. Blackpool is very different from Liverpool and Manchester. With its long beaches, hotels and piers, Blackpool is a popular holiday town. Here you can eat fish and chips, go to amusement arcades and see the coloured lights on Blackpool Tower. Some of the most interesting sights of England are in the far north of the country. Durham Cathedral, almost 900 years old, is here, and also the Angel of the North, the biggest sculpture in England. The sculpture, of an angel with very wide wings, was built on an old coal mine by Anthony Gormley, the same artist who made another place, see the fact box opposite. He wanted people to remember that for 200 years mining was one of the biggest industries in this area. People pass the Angel of the North as they drive to Newcastle upon Tyne. Like Manchester and Liverpool, Newcastle is another industrial city that now has museums, art galleries, and an exciting nightlife. Near Newcastle is the end of Hadrian's Wall, parts of which can be seen very clearly. Today the border with Scotland is further north than it was when the Romans built Hadrian's Wall. Just a few kilometers from today's border is another interesting site, Holy Island or Lindisfarne. You cannot get to the island at high tide, when the sea comes in closest to the land, but at other times you can walk or drive across to it and see the castle that was built here in the 16th century. Back in the south of England and west of London there are more sights and interesting cities to see. Bath, so called because of its famous Roman baths, is a lovely little city. The old Roman baths are some of the best kept in Europe, and in the 18th century many rich and important people came here to take the waters. Big fine houses were built for them, and so Bath has many Georgian streets and buildings with pretty parks too. Just a few kilometers further west from Bath, but very different, is the big busy city of Bristol. Bristol, once a very big port, now has a strong electronics industry and is important in the creative media, film, TV, radio, and fashion. It is also the biggest cultural center in the area with a busy nightlife. As in many other cities in England, the old docks, the area where the ships used to come in, have now been changed into an area for restaurants, shops, and museums. One of the most famous sights of Bristol is the Clifton Suspension Bridge, which was made by the great engineer Isambard Kingdom, Brunei. Many visitors to Bristol make the short journey south to Glastonbury. Here you can visit Glastonbury Abbey, which was built in the 7th century. Glastonbury is also famous for the music festival held there most years in June. It is the biggest music festival in the country. Stonehenge east of Glastonbury is one of the wonders of the world. The big stone circles here were made between 3000 BC and 1600 BC. They are as old as Egypt's pyramids. One of the most interesting things about Stonehenge is that some of the stones are very heavy, up to 40 tons, but they came from hundreds of kilometers away in Wales. People believe they were probably brought and pulled to Stonehenge in simple boats. But no one is sure how they got to Stonehenge. On the longest day of the year, the sun rises across the stone circles. Because of this, many people think the circles were perhaps some kind of ancient calendar. In the county of Cornwall in the far southwest of England, you can visit the Eden Project. Here you can see plants and trees from many different places and the largest non-wild rainforest in the world. Brighton on the south coast became an important town in the mid-18th century when people began to enjoy swimming in the sea. The Prince of Wales, later King George IV, started to come to Brighton in the 1780s, and in 1815 the Royal Pavilion was built for him. The Royal Pavilion, which has a strange mixture of Indian and Chinese building styles, is one of the most interesting buildings in Brighton today. Like Bath, Brighton has some beautiful Georgian buildings, but it is a fun town too. Here you can walk on the pier beside the sea or through the lanes, narrow streets that were once part of the old fishing village of Brighton and which are now busy with shops and restaurants. Northeast of Brighton on the road to Dover, Canterbury, is a place full of history. It was an important Roman town, and in AD 602 the first cathedral in England was built here. The cathedral was rebuilt in 1070 and continues to be very important today. The Archbishop of Canterbury is the head of the Church of England. As you can see, there are lots of exciting places to visit in England. Chapter 5: Nature and the Environment. England has some exciting and beautiful cities and many interesting sights. But for a lot of people, the best thing about England is its countryside. Mostly England is a place of green hills, but it also has lakes, rivers, a long coastline that is very different in different parts of the country and in the North Mountains. Because there are so many different kinds of environments in England, there is a lot of wildlife too. Around the coast you can see seals, sharks, dolphins and otters, and rabbits, foxes, squirrels. And deer are just some of the animals that move around the countryside freely. Nearly 230 different kinds of birds live in England, and another 200 visit for part of the year. There are also many different kinds of trees, plants, and wild flowers growing in the English countryside. The weather in England is temperate, almost never very hot or very cold, with lots of rain all year. It is usually warmest between June and September, but the weather in any month can be very different from year to year. England has 10 national parks, beautiful areas of countryside whereas the special laws keep the land and wildlife safe. The biggest of these is the Lake District in the northwest of England. The Lake District has the highest mountains in the country, with 16 big lakes lying below them. With its beautiful scenery, the Lake District is not surprisingly a very popular place for tourists. Most visitors come to walk in the mountains, to go on boats on the lakes, and to enjoy the area's pretty stone-built villages. There is also a lot of wildlife in the Lake District, and it is the only place in the country where golden eagles, birds of prey, live. In the 18th and 19th centuries, many poets began to write about the Lake District. The most famous of these was William Wordsworth, who lived there for 60 years. The poems and books that he wrote about the Lake District made many people come and visit the area for the first time. Another famous writer from the Lake District is Beatrix Potter, whose children's books about Peter Rabbit and his friends are famous around the world. Today, a lot of tourists visit the house near Hawkshead where she wrote many of her books. There are 4 other national parks in the north of England. The Peak District, the Yorkshire Dales, and the Northumberland National Park are all part of the Pennines, an area of low mountains in the middle of the north of England. The Pennine Way, a walking trail 429 kilometers long, goes along these mountains, which make a kind of natural border between east and west. East of the Pennines is the north of England's other national park, the North York Moors, between York in the south and Middlesbrough in the north. In all these northern national parks you can find deep valleys covered with forests, high moorland, and wonderful caves, natural holes in the rock in the hillside, and they are great places for walking, cycling, or horse riding. People who have read Wuthering Heights, Jane Eyre, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, or any of the other books by Charlotte Emily and Anne Bronte, probably feel that they already know the countryside of the Pennines. The Bronte sisters lived in Haworth in Yorkshire, and they describe the windy, heather-covered moorland of this area in many of their books. The history of the New Forest, about 100 kilometers southwest of London, begins more than 900 years ago. William the Conqueror wanted this area to be kept for hunting, and he and his nobles enjoyed looking for deer and other animals here. Parts of the New Forest, which is now a national park, have probably not changed very much since these times. Today cows walk freely around this area with its ancient trees and open land covered with heather. Visitors here can also see beautiful wild flowers, deer, and big birds of prey. But most famous are the ponies, about 3,000 of them, that live in the New Forest, as they have for many years. You can often see them walking around the villages of the New Forest, and you must be ready to stop your car when one decides to cross the road. Between Exeter and Plymouth, the National Park of Dartmoor in Devon is the biggest and wildest area of open countryside in the south of England. A lot of Dartmoor is moorland and covered in heather, but Dartmoor is also famous for its many tors, hills with rocks at the top. Sheep, cows, and ponies walk freely around on Dartmoor, and many birds live here too. North of Dartmoor is the National Park of Exmoor, a beautiful area of moorland forests, valleys, and farmland, which goes across the counties of Somerset and Devon right up to the coast. Here you can see otters in nearly every river, wild red deer, bats, and some very special butterflies. Devon is not only famous for Dartmoor and Exmoor. The counties of Devon and Cornwall are very popular with tourists because of their lovely countryside, and because they get more hours of sunlight than anywhere else in England. Away from the coast, the green fields are full of wild flowers in the summer, and narrow little roads with tall hedges at the side go from one pretty village to the next. By the sea there are golden beaches and little rocky coves, and on the north coast the big waves in places like Newquay make surfing a very popular sport. Off the coasts of Devon and Cornwall you can see basking sharks and porpoises, and on Lundy Island there are puffins in April and May. Another beautiful area to visit in this part of England are the Scilly Isles, about 100 small islands 45 kilometers away from Land's End in England's far southwest corner. Each island is very different, and people live on only 5 of them. Along England's south coast, big white cliffs, large rocks next to the sea, look out onto the English Channel. The rocks in the cliffs on part of this coast, which is called the Jurassic Coast and goes from East Devon to Dorset, are 185 million years old. Here you can easily find wonderful fossils, rocks with the shape of animals and plants from ancient times. You can see lots of fossils here because of erosion. The rock is very soft and every day the sea breaks bits of the rock away from the cliffs. Erosion has made parts of this coast very beautiful. The perfect little cove at Lulworth in Dorset and the famous Arch of Durdle Door were both made by erosion. England's newest national park is the South Downs, which comes down to the sea near Brighton. You can walk through the beautiful green hills of the South Downs on the South Downs. Way a special walking trail which ends at the enormous white cliffs of Beachy Head on the south coast. Most of the North Sea coast of England, on the east side of the country, is very flat and sandy with a lot of salt marsh, wet muddy areas with grass growing on them. There are many sea birds here and also at Blakeney Point in Norfolk several hundred seals. This is the best place in England to see seals and many people take special boat trips to visit them. The National Park of the Norfolk Broads is also in this area. Here 3 rivers go across flat land to the sea and are so wide in places they are almost like lakes. Many people like to visit this area by boat or by bike, enjoying the wonderful bird life. England has a lot of beautiful countryside, but there are many problems for the environment. Factories, vehicles, and modern farming can make the air, rivers, and the sea dirty, and this is bad for plants and wildlife. Many animals also lose their homes when forests are cut down or land is taken for building houses on. People believe that global warming, the earth getting hotter because of dangerous gases in the air, is bringing new problems to the countryside too. It is because of these dangers to the environment that the national parks of England were made. And there are many organizations that work to keep wildlife and the English countryside safe. The UK government is also working with governments from other countries to try to find ways to fight global warming. English people hope that they and the tourists who come to their country will always be able to enjoy the wonderful natural environment.